When looking at the militaries of the ancient world, such as the great legions of the Roman Republic or the grand sprawling phalanxes of Alexander the Great, the sheer numbers are staggering, with armies numbering in the tens if not hundreds of thousands. However, centuries later in the Western Europe of the Middle Ages, armies had become significantly smaller, counting in a few thousand at the most. Why did the scale of warfare shrink so drastically between antiquity and the medieval era? In this video, we will explore the various answers to this question. It might be that you don't need that many people to get the job done. A few good champions will do it. That's more than enough in our sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. And the power of love helps too. So here are our top 3 champion couples. Number 3, Seducer and Temptress. Now there's a combo that's going to get along. Pair them in game and you get buffs that reduce damage, and Temptress can get some extra turns in battle. Number 2, Siphi and Rotos. They look a little mad, but you can tell they're a great couple because Siphi removes Rotos' debuffs every turn and reduces damage from bosses. Romantic. Number 1, Harrier and Hospitaller. Now this combo actually sucks, but that's where the romance comes in. Right now in Raid, they're running a Valentine's Day event for all new players until March 14th, where you can play a load of Valentine's Day minigames to win not only champions and in-game items, but real-life Amazon gift cards worth up to $1,000. Get the game via our links below, copy your player ID, then paste it in at raidlovequest.plarium.com to sign up. And existing players can use code STValentine23 to claim a free Valentine's Day gift. And speaking of free stuff, if you start playing Raid via our link in the description or by scanning the QR code on the screen, you'll get a load of in-game bonuses worth $35, including the epic champion Jotun. See the power of your champions now in Raid Shadow Legends. Attempting to estimate the exact numbers of soldiers different armies were composed of in the past is rarely easy, as these numbers are given to us by chroniclers and historians from centuries past, who can often be misleading, as they would either boast or reduce numbers to make a victory seem even more majestic, or a loss to be more easily digestible and less catastrophic, depending on what the one who recounts the battle wants to convey. Even once one arrives at a good estimation based on historical sources, it is still hard to distinguish official combatants from non-combatants accompanying the army, whether they were there for logistic support, such as porters and cooks, or as freebooters in search of loot and fortune. Having premised these elements, we will now tackle the main question. Why did the armies of the medieval era seem so small when compared to the armies of the empires of the classical era? During the Second Persian invasion of Greece, when King Xerxes' army defeated the Spartan-led Greek army at Thermopylae, modern historians believe that the Persian King of Kings was accompanied by around 100,000 soldiers, a very sizable army for its time, though still less than the unrealistic 2.5 million claimed by the Greek historian Herodotus, who, like many other sources of the classical era, greatly inflates the numbers of armies up to ridiculous numbers. Some 400 years later, at the Battle of Philippi, fought between the second triumvir of Mark Antony and Octavian and Caesar's assassins, modern historians believe that both sides fielded legions numbering around 60 to 80,000 men. Even as late as the end of the 4th century, the Roman Empire under Julian the Apostate invaded the Persian Empire with an army of over 60,000 troops, backed by an incredible fleet of logistics to keep the force going. Let us now compare these numbers specifically to the armies fielded by the kings of Western Europe in the Middle Ages. For example, at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, Philippe, the King of France, managed to raise around 6,500 men against Emperor Otto IV of the Holy Roman Empire, who brought with him 9,000 men. During the 100 Years' War, the English armies that attacked France usually numbered around 10,000 men, and often half that when they were not accompanied by a prince, while the French Royal Army managed to muster around 20,000 men a few times, but had usually less. Of course, in both of these examples, we're not seeing the sum total of all the military forces available to those kingdoms. And different elements limited the number of total troops that could be brought onto the battlefield, as the French King Philippe II had to leave a third of his men to his son to confront an English expedition elsewhere, while during the 100 Years' War, the Plantagenet monarchs were often hampered by shipping capacity. Still, overall, we can see a distinct decrease in medieval army size when compared to their ancient forebears. To partially explain this, firstly we need to remember that to raise, pay and supply an army, a ruler needs the financial and material backing from the state it governs, and here we can see the first difference between the ancient and medieval worlds. The empires of antiquity were both geographically larger and more populated than the kingdoms of the Middle Ages, able to draw resources and manpower from a larger pool, and governed by an efficient bureaucracy based on centuries of governmental evolution. Bigger empires and resources also meant better transportation networks for the purposes of communication, logistics and internal movement. This allowed easier mobilization over greater regions, as troops could be moved and fed with greater ease. The Roman Empire at its height is estimated to have had a standing army of 400,000 men, but these were distributed throughout its many different provinces and locally supplied from them. Meanwhile, medieval Europe was more politically fractured and less centralized than ancient Rome ever was, as Germanic migrations split up the western half of the erstwhile empire into a handful of smaller kingdoms. While in the 9th century, after a brief revival of a more centralized administration brought about by the Carolingian dynasty, the dissolution of said Carolingians gave rise to the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire, both states which featured a landholding aristocracy that was broadly autonomous from, and often even in conflict with, the royal central power. Overall, medieval states were also just geographically smaller in comparison to their ancient counterparts, while the central government was generally weaker, save for a few exceptions during Charlemagne's reign of his empire, or a few localized attempts, like the Kingdom of Naples. This meant fewer resources and fewer troops. While the High and Late Middle Ages are generally well attested to, estimating the size of armies in the early Middle Ages is extremely hard, as sources from this period are scarce and extremely unreliable. Various chronicles mention how during this era, hosts as small as 100 men could cause significant damage in some regions, as rural settlements were small. Ettonian sources from the 10th century mention 50 slaughtered knights as an enormous setback, indicating that entire armies at the time probably numbered in the low thousands. As for the total number of raisable troops, we have documents claiming that the Ettonian Empire could raise 20,000 armed saddled men, while another document from the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Wessex has been used to extrapolate a field army of around 5,500. But historians point out that these numbers were, in fact, just theoretical strengths on paper, and that the actual numbers were probably lower. Other academics have attempted to extrapolate numbers by looking at what the economy of Western Europe could sustain at a time. Following the 6th century, Europe had fallen into a general economic depression, particularly in northern Gaul and Brittany, as towns declined and large swaths of terrain were abandoned. As a result, settlements were small, so an army of say 5,000 men could represent many times the size of a town in an area, and the presence of such a force in such a relatively depopulated region could be devastating, as the soldiers would forage an area to sustain themselves, which usually meant squeezing food and supplies from the already sparse local peasantry. It has been theorized that because of the supply situation between the 6th and 10th centuries, most armies during that time were no larger than 5,000 to 6,000. Granted, larger empires such as the Carolingians could probably deploy more armies at a time, and in the case of defense it might have been possible to double the numbers. Let us move on from the early Middle Ages and into the High Middle Ages of the 9th to 12th centuries. During this era, wars were mostly local conflicts, like feuds between neighbouring noble families or rival city-states in northern Italy. As such, the number of men who fought in those battles were generally small due to both pure necessity and the number of actors involved. However, one exception during this time was the Crusades, which saw armies of up to 20 or 30,000 men participate in the grand struggle for the Holy Land. Of course, it needs to be noted that these armies were composed of many different smaller contingents and armies from different countries and regions. In general, the high medieval armies of Western Europe were characterized by small hosts, whose most important element was the heavy cavalry, supplied by the landlords and their retinues, who were accompanied by levies of commoners. These crucial corps of heavy cavalry were expensive to maintain, meaning that their numbers had to be limited. In some regions, initially in northern Italy, the lowlands, and later in other areas, the emergence of larger towns also increased the importance of urban militias. What bound these nobles and cities to the ruler was an oath of loyalty that could be weak, and pay was often the reward of lands and war spoils. The requirement of loyalty from their subjects meant that a ruler's army could vary considerably depending on his internal situation, and internal support was required to field the entire army of the realm. For example, in the Battle of Bouvines, Emperor Otto IV of Germany allegedly only brought a few knights from his personal retinue, with the rest of his army being supplied by local allies in the Low Countries. The reason for his low personal troop count was his low support in the Holy Roman Empire, as he was engulfed in the feud between the Guelphs and Ghibellines at the time. This would also continue in later periods, such as during the 100 Years' War, where the number of troops that defended the English-held province of Gascony depended greatly on the level of support the English Plantagenet kings enjoyed in the region. Around the 12th century, the military capacity of medieval kingdoms began to grow, as a monetary economy was established throughout Christendom, while royal governments developed greater control over their vassals. This allowed rulers to pay troops and keep them in the field for greater periods of time, longer than what the feudal obligations initially entailed. This meant that the medieval rulers could wage longer campaigns, such as the English forays into France during the 100 Years' War, which had campaigns spanning around a year long, financed by taxes raised in the country and later allocated by Parliament. During the High and Late Middle Ages, mercenaries also became more common, as the French hired Italians and Scots during the latter part of the war. Still, it was not always easy to find the funds to finance these soldiers, and the introduction of regular pay did not phase out the right to plunder, which was not uncommonly mentioned in military contracts as part of the official pay, especially during the English raids into French territory, the devastating chevauchées. Having discussed broadly some of the reasons for the smaller size of medieval armies, let us look at some specific examples across the Middle Ages, beginning with a case study of the size of the Bulgarian army throughout the Middle Ages. At the time of the First Bulgarian Empire, the average number of soldiers a Tsar could field was around 12 to 20,000 men, while their southern neighbours and rivals, the larger Eastern Roman Empire, could field approximately 25,000 men. Centuries later, the Second Bulgarian Empire could field approximately 15,000 men, depending on the situation. Another example we will analyse is England. Between the 1270s and the start of the 1300s, Edward I of England campaigned in Scotland and Wales with armies ranging between 5,000 and 11,000 men, with cavalry being less than 2,000 men. During the Siege of Calais in 1348, after the victory at the Battle of Crécy, around 30,000 men participated at different times. However, only around 10 to 11,000 men participated at a time. So it can be extrapolated that the English king Henry III, before the Black Plague, had around 30,000 men able to fight, while being capable of fielding around a third of these at a time with his finances and the kingdom's navy. For the rest of the war, the English found it difficult to field armies larger than 10,000 on the mainland, most often hampered by the difficulty to find sufficient numbers of ships to ferry the troops, as these had to be drafted from merchants. So in conclusion, why were medieval armies so small? The causes can be found in the territorial and political fragmentation the continent was embroiled in, and the difficulties rulers had to supply their armies. All these and more contribute to the relatively smaller scale present in medieval warfare compared to its ancient equivalent. More videos on medieval history are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members. whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.